He didn't walk into the room to play along with the show. From the moment he took his seat, there was an air of deliberate calm, the kind that only someone truly in control can carry. The setting was tense. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a light-hearted exchange. People came expecting sparks, and what they got instead was a masterclass in control, wit, and subtle obliteration. While others came armed with rehearsed outrage and loud one-liners, he brought something far more dangerous: facts wrapped in poise and delivered with surgical precision. As the discussion began to unfold, it quickly became clear that someone was on the stage to steal the spotlight, to perform. But there was one voice that didn't need to raise itself. He waited, listened, even allowed interruptions to pass unchallenged. It was a kind of restraint that only made what came next all the more powerful. When he finally spoke, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't chaotic. It was like someone cutting through a thick fog with a beam of cold, undeniable clarity. What made it so effective wasn't just the words. It was the calmness of it all. No yelling, no dramatic gestures. Just a slow, relentless unraveling of empty arguments. Every sentence was wrapped in politeness, but every point landed with the force of a hammer. It was like watching someone dismantle a house, not with explosives, but with a set of precise tools and a knowing smile. He didn't engage in insults. He didn't take the bait. When provoked, he responded with a kind of grace that only highlighted the desperation on the other side. There was no effort to match volume or dramatics. Instead, he leaned into substance. When asked vague questions, he gave sharp, clear answers. When someone tried to distract or pivot, he steered everything right back to the facts. It was clear. He wasn't just participating in the moment, he was controlling it, and everyone felt it. The silence that followed some of his remarks wasn't out of politeness, it was stunned disbelief. Because what he did in that room wasn't typical. It wasn't the usual political theater filled with slogans and emotional outbursts. It was something altogether different. Quiet domination through intellect and a refusal to stoop to the level of chaos. Every pause he allowed after a statement was its own form of punctuation. A dare, almost. A challenge to refute what couldn't be refuted. There was a rhythm to it. While others tried to force their way through with emotional appeals and personal barbs, he laid out point after point with a kind of brutal elegance. The performance from across the aisle began to look more and more hollow. The loud declarations, the exaggerated expressions, they started to look like theater playing to an audience that had stopped clapping. The real shock wasn't in a single line or a mic drop moment. It was in the total dismantling of an argument, without even looking like he was trying. That's the kind of effectiveness that makes people shift in their chairs, not because they're offended, but because they've just watched someone get verbally disassembled without ever being directly insulted. That's rare, and when it happens, people don't forget it. There was a moment, brief but telling, when the energy in the room shifted. It was subtle, just a few faces changing expression, just a few whispers falling silent. That's when everyone understood what had just happened. A political performance had been exposed for what it was, a spectacle without weight. And it didn't need to be shouted down, it just needed to be met with reality. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He simply waited for the storm to quiet, then reminded everyone with a firm but unshaken presence that this was not a game. That truth doesn't need volume. That clarity is more powerful than any performance. And once that reality landed, no one in the room could look away. She arrived ready for the cameras. From the moment the session began, it was clear she wasn't just speaking, she was performing. Her words came quickly, laced with sharp tones and bursts of passion. She leaned into her delivery, using every tool at her disposal to draw attention. Dramatic pauses, raised eyebrows, biting sarcasm. She spoke like someone convinced she had the upper hand, as if all she had to do was speak loud enough, and the truth would somehow arrange itself around her. But then something shifted. Across from her, she faced not a showman, not a reactionary, but someone completely unfazed by the theatrics. There was no scrambling to respond, no rush to interrupt. Just steady composure and a silence that said, "Go ahead, finish." And when the time came to respond, what came wasn't rage or a counter-performance. It was something much harder to dismiss. Facts. Point by point, the entire framework of her argument was quietly dismantled. There was no shouting match, no insult for insult retaliation, just a methodical correction of falsehoods, a calm refutation of exaggerations, and a steady stream of inconvenient truths. She had walked in ready to spar with someone who'd flinch under pressure, but instead found herself facing someone who didn't even blink. The difference became obvious very quickly. While she delivered slogans, he delivered citations. While she talked about feelings, he pointed to records. While she spoke broadly about oppression and injustice, he gently asked for specifics. And when the specifics failed to materialize, the cracks began to show. Her rhythm faltered. Her tone grew sharper. She began talking faster, trying to regain control of a narrative that had started slipping through her fingers. What had begun as a confident display slowly turned into a defensive scramble, and all the while, her opponent remained calm, never mocking, never dismissive, just relentless in the pursuit of clarity. The contrast couldn't have been starker. One side operated in the realm of optics, trying to turn a hearing into a stage. The other stuck to substance, reducing her arguments to a series of missteps that unraveled under the weight of facts. It wasn't flashy, but it was devastating. Every time she tried to pivot, to bring the conversation back to familiar ground, filled with broad claims and emotional appeals, she was guided gently but firmly back to the issue at hand. Theatrics were ignored, name-calling was met with silence, and every accusation was met with a question that demanded something more than a slogan. And that's where it all began to fall apart, because there was nothing left to fall back on. The talking points weren't landing, the crowd wasn't reacting the way she hoped. And most importantly, her counterpart wasn't playing the part she had expected. This wasn't someone she could fluster. This wasn't someone she could goad into making a mistake. Instead, he stayed on message and refused to be dragged into the mud. The more she tried to assert control, the more obvious it became that she didn't have it. Each time she doubled down, each time she tried to raise the emotional stakes, she was met with calm, direct replies that pulled the moment back to reality. It was the equivalent of trying to start a fire with wet matches. What had once felt like momentum became desperation. Her barbs became more personal, her voice more strained, and yet the response remained unchanged. Calm, focused, utterly unshaken. Every attempt at provocation fizzled. Every swing she took landed in empty air, because what she was up against wasn't aggression, it was discipline. And the room could feel it, not in an explosive way, but in that slow, creeping realization that something wasn't going according to plan. The silence between exchanges started to linger longer. The tension thickened. She had come to make a statement, but now she was being asked questions she couldn't quite answer. And worse, the spotlight she had claimed was beginning to expose the very weakness she had tried to hide with volume. It wasn't personal, it wasn't petty, it was precise, and it left her exposed, not by insult. There are moments in public discourse that demand attention, not because they're loud, but because they're undeniable. This wasn't one of those explosive meltdowns filled with shouting and chaos. No. What happened here was far more unsettling. To those on the receiving end, a calm dismantling of a performance done with such poise that it stopped the room cold. The kind of silence that fell wasn't the polite quiet of procedural order. It was the stunned, heavy pause that follows. A blow no one saw coming. At first, it all felt routine. The political theater unfolded as expected, with all the predictable energy. Grandstanding, quick quips, and carefully rehearsed outrage echoed across the hearing room like a scripted drama. One figure in particular took center stage early. Quick, with the insults, expressive with body language, and clearly aware of every camera in the room. It was less about substance and more about spectacle, the kind that trends for 30 seconds but evaporates just as fast. She was building momentum, delivering line after line meant to draw applause or at least get clipped for the internet. And then came a shift, so subtle at first that few noticed it happening. It didn't involve raised voices or emotional outbursts. Instead, it unfolded slowly and with devastating precision. In response to her theatrics came calm questions, clear, measured, and firmly rooted in reality. With each sentence, the energy began to shift. What was once a confident display began to look more and more like overcompensation. It didn't take long before the oxygen was sucked out of the room. The dramatic momentum she had built evaporated under the weight of careful, factual rebuttals. She had been expecting a fight, maybe even hoping for one, something to energize her audience. But what she got instead was a quiet exposure of every weak point in her presentation. The statistics didn't hold up. The anecdotes were met with nuance. And the moment she realized she was being cornered by nothing but calm, undeniable logic, something changed in her demeanor. Her voice lost some of its strength. The witty jabs stopped coming. She began to speak more slowly, less sure of her footing. She looked around, possibly hoping for support, but even her allies sat still. Because when someone is being shown up not with fire but with facts, it's hard to jump in and save them without looking equally unprepared. Then came the line. Not loud, not angry, just carefully placed, like a pin dropping in a quiet cathedral. A sentence so loaded with truth and restraint that it landed harder than any insult ever could. You could almost hear the collective inhale of everyone in the room. It wasn't just a moment of clarity, it was a moment of exposure. One side had been performing, the other had simply been waiting to reveal the script. That's when the silence truly fell. Not the silence of respect, but the silence of discomfort. The kind that fills a room when people realize they've just witnessed someone lose a battle they thought they were winning. Eyes shifted. Body language changed. Even those who had been nodding along minutes earlier now sat still, unsure of how to react. Outside that room, the moment was already beginning to ripple. Clips of the exchange spread with lightning speed. People weren't just sharing it, they were pausing, rewinding, and watching again. Not because it was explosive, but because it was masterful. The calmness, the clarity, the restraint. It stood out in a landscape full of noise. And viewers recognized it instantly for what it was. Rare. The internet lit up, but not with outrage. With awe. The usual commentators scrambled to analyze it, trying to reframe or justify, but the raw footage spoke for itself. You didn't need context. You didn't need partisanship. All you needed was to watch one side try to sell a performance, while the other side quietly walked circles around it with logic. It wasn't the kind of moment that fades with the news cycle. It was the kind people reference long after. The kind that gets replayed not for the spectacle, but for the skill. No one had been shouted down. No one had stormed out. The victory had come through silence, through restraint, through simple, undeniable truth. And in that moment, every voice in the room, whether they liked it or not, had to pause and listen. Beneath the sharp exchanges and the headline-grabbing moments, there was a deeper message woven through every word spoken. This wasn't about scoring points or winning applause. It was about cutting through the noise that has come to define too much of modern political discourse. The endless back and forth of talking past one another, the grandstanding for social media, the reliance on identity politics instead of ideas. All of it was quietly challenged in a way that made everyone in the room take notice. The underlying tone was clear. This isn't entertainment. This isn't a reality show where charisma outshines competence or where the loudest voice automatically wins. This is a governing body, a place where serious decisions are made that impact millions. And if the focus is not on truth, reason, and accountability, then what is the point? This challenge was delivered without rancor, but with undeniable firmness, a call to return to substance over spectacle. The frustration beneath the surface wasn't just with any single person, but with a broader culture of political posturing that has taken root in the halls of power. There was a sense that the performance on display wasn't just unhelpful, it was dangerous. When politics becomes about winning attention rather than solving problems, the public suffers. Policies get watered down, meaningful debates get replaced by sound bites, and the trust of the people erodes. That message, though never spoken outright, was clear through every carefully chosen phrase and measured response. This quiet admonition hit particularly hard because it came from a place of experience and seriousness. It wasn't a cheap shot or a partisan jab, but a plea for accountability and responsibility. It was a reminder that public service requires more than just passion and personality. It requires facts, preparation, and a willingness to engage with difficult questions honestly. Throughout the exchange, there was a refusal to get distracted by the emotional theatrics or attempts to shift the conversation toward personal grievances or cultural talking points. Instead, the focus remained steadfast on the issues that truly matter. It was as if someone was saying, "Enough with the noise. Let's talk about what actually affects people's lives." The implicit call was for politicians to do their jobs instead of playing to the crowd. What made this message resonate was its unvarnished truth. In a political environment where grandstanding often drowns out serious discussion, it stood out like a beacon. It was a challenge not just to one individual, but to an entire system that too often rewards spectacle over substance. And it was, delivered with a calm that made it harder to dismiss as mere partisan theatrics. The room's atmosphere reflected this tension. It wasn't just the weight of the moment. It was the realization that many of the performances seen day after day are distractions from the real work needed. That recognition was palpable among those watching closely. They saw a demand for a return to genuine debate, to accountability, and to respect for the responsibilities that come with holding public office. Even those sympathetic to the performance, being challenged couldn't help but feel the impact. Because the underlying truth is uncomfortable. If you rely more on style than substance, sooner or later you will be called out. And when that call comes not with fire and fury, but with steady, unshakable logic, it's harder to deflect or dodge. This moment was a reminder that politics is supposed to be about more than just winning headlines or rallying a base. It is about serving the public, making decisions based on evidence and principle, and being willing to stand firm even when it's not popular. The message was clear. If you want to be taken seriously, you need to act seriously. The power of this message came not from its delivery but from its content. It was a reminder that the circus atmosphere many have grown used to is not inevitable. It is a choice. And those who choose to indulge in spectacle rather than substance are ultimately doing a disservice, not just to themselves or their opponents, but to the very people they claim to represent. In the end, the deeper point was unmistakable. Stop treating politics like a performance and start treating it like the hard, important work it is. The call was subtle but firm, a demand that the games stop and the real conversations begin. For anyone watching closely, it was a moment that challenged the status quo and dared to hold politicians to a higher standard. This exchange wasn't just a fleeting moment of political sparring. It was a vivid illustration of what happens when substance confronts spectacle. It showed how calm, measured truth can cut through the noise and expose the gaps where empty rhetoric once stood. In an era where political theater often overshadows meaningful dialogue, this was a powerful reminder that clarity, facts, and respect for the process still hold incredible weight. What stood out most was the refusal to be distracted by flashy performances or loud declarations. Instead, the focus remained on the core issues, real problems requiring real solutions. That kind of discipline and dedication to truth is rare, but essential. It demonstrated that politics doesn't have to be a contest of who can shout the loudest or who can garner the most applause. It can be a place where ideas are challenged respectfully, facts are weighed carefully, and decisions are made thoughtfully. This moment also underscored the importance of accountability. When politicians are called out, not with personal attacks, but with facts and logic, it elevates the entire conversation. It challenges everyone involved to rise above the theatrics and engage honestly with the issues at hand. That's the kind of accountability the public deserves and desperately needs. Moreover, the silence that followed certain statements was telling. It was a silence not born of politeness, but of recognition. recognition that the usual tactics, grandstanding, appeals to identity, and emotional manipulation were ineffective in the face of clear, unshakable truth. That silence spoke volumes about the power of reason and the limits of performance. The ripple effect went far beyond the room where it happened. Clips circulated online, sparking widespread discussion and analysis. People from across the political spectrum took notice, not because they wanted to pick sides, but because they witnessed a rare moment of genuine debate. It was a moment that transcended party lines and reminded everyone what political discourse can and should be. At its core, this episode was a call to return to a higher standard. It was a challenge to politicians everywhere to move past shallow theatrics and to commit to serious, substantive engagement. The message was clear. The public is tired of the circus. They want leaders who will focus on facts, engage respectfully with opposing views, and work diligently toward solutions that benefit everyone. This is not just about one hearing or one exchange, it's about the kind of political culture that we choose to foster. It's about demanding more from those who represent us and refusing to settle for less. It's about recognizing that democracy depends not on spectacle, but on substance. And when substance is present, even the most heated debates can become opportunities for growth, understanding, and progress. In a time when division and distraction seem to dominate, this moment offered a glimpse of what can be achieved when truth, respect, and seriousness lead the way. It's a reminder that the future of political discourse doesn't have to be defined by noise and spectacle, but by clarity and purpose. And that's a message worth remembering and demanding moving.